This morning, something quietly broke. A man named Galibaf, Iran's parliamentary speaker, the same man who sat across from Vance for 21 hours straight in Islamabad, has reportedly resigned, not retired, not stepped aside for routine reasons, resigned in protest. And the reason behind that resignation is what makes this moment different from every other moment in this conflict. He supported a deal. The URG killed it. He walked. The proposal that triggered all of this came through Qatar. It was careful, measured, designed to give both sides something to stand on. 20 Iranian vessels would receive guaranteed passage through the Strait of Hormuz. In return, 20 vessels from Arab Gulf ports would receive the same, equal numbers, neither side formally surrendering anything on the sovereignty question. Galibaf backed it. He believed it was a path forward. The URG looked at it and said no. But here's what most coverage is getting wrong about that rejection. The URG didn't say no to the numbers. They said no to the framing, because a reciprocal arrangement where Gulf vessels have the same access rights as Iranian vessels implies bilateral equivalence, and bilateral equivalence undermines Iran's claim that the strait operates under Iranian sovereign authority alone. So the URG didn't just block a policy proposal, they removed the man who made it. That distinction matters enormously. There's a difference between telling a negotiator his idea was rejected and telling him he needs to go. One is a disagreement, the other is a message, and the message the URG sent this morning to Galibaf, to Iran's entire diplomatic class, and to every country watching is that the military command has already made its decision about where this conflict is headed. Oil is sitting at 106.8 this morning. That's a 5% rise from Wednesday alone, and China has not said a single word. Let's talk about what the URG's power actually looks like right now, because this isn't speculation or geopolitical theory. Euronews and Iran International both confirmed this week that under wartime conditions, all critical positions inside Iran must be chosen and directly managed by the Revolutionary Guards. That's the official structure. Galibaf and Araghchi, the two most visible diplomatic faces Iran has put forward, cannot make decisions without URG approval. President Pezeshkian himself has been blocked from key decisions. The appointment of Mohammad Baghar Zolgadar as Secretary of the Supreme National Security Council was forced onto Pezeshkian by URG commanders over his direct objections. The civilian government isn't a fiction. It exists, it sends delegations, it issues statements, it negotiates, but every single decision those delegations produce is subject to URG veto. And today, for the first time on a live proposal that had real traction, the URG used that veto. Trump has been posting about this on Truth Social this morning. He's saying Iran is in turmoil, that nobody knows who the leader is, that the infighting between hardliners and moderates is serious. He's right about the infighting, but he's reading it completely backward. He's treating the URG's victory over Galibaf as evidence of Iranian weakness. It is the opposite. A country is not weakened when its most decisive faction consolidates power. It becomes more coherent, and a more coherent URG, one that has just publicly demonstrated it can remove the chief diplomat when it disagrees with his direction, is not an Iran that is closer to a deal. It is an Iran that has just eliminated the person who came closest to one. Now let's talk about what China sees when it looks at this moment, because China does not read international politics the way Western cable news does. China doesn't look at Galibaf's resignation and see a dysfunction story. It sees a pattern. Specifically, it recognizes something called diplomatic displacement, the moment when a country's moderate diplomatic faction is pushed aside by its military command at the exact point when a deal was achievable. China has seen this before, multiple times, and it knows what comes next. The most precise historical parallel isn't Japan in 1941, that military consolidation happened years before Pearl Harbor. The sharper parallel is August of 1914. In the final days before World War I began, German Foreign Secretary Jago and Austrian Foreign Minister Burke told the officials conducting the back channels were systematically bypassed by their military commands as the generals activated war plans that couldn't be reversed. The civilian diplomats had frameworks for de-escalation. The generals had mobilization schedules. The schedules won. Within 72 hours of diplomatic displacement, a war began that nobody had actually planned to start. The point here is not that we're headed toward a world war. The point is the mechanism, when a military command displaces its diplomatic moderates at the exact moment a deal is within reach, it means the military has calculated that the cost of the deal is higher than the cost of continued conflict. The URG blocked the Qatari proposal because it has already done that math. A strategically permanent Hormuz, one that Iran controls without question, without bilateral equivalence, is worth more to them than any arrangement America is currently offering. China reads that calculation with precision, because China spent the last decade building the exact system that allows Iran to hold that position without collapsing. Before this war, Iran was exporting 1.68 million barrels of oil per day. During the most intense weeks of the conflict, when Hormuz was largely closed and American bombing was at its peak, Iran exported 1.84 million barrels per day, more oil during the war than before it. China's customs records officially show zero imports from Iran. But China's recorded imports of so-called Malaysian crude run to 1.3 million barrels per day. Malaysia's entire national oil production is not even close to that number. That oil is Iranian, transponders off, ship-to-ship transfers in Malaysian waters, relabeled, delivered to Chinese teapot refineries without documentation. China built this system quietly over a decade, unpayments routed through second-tier Chinese banks outside of SWIFT, a dark fleet operating in the shadows, a strategic reserve of 1.2 billion barrels built specifically from sanctioned Iranian and Russian crude. The entire architecture was designed for exactly this moment, so that when Hormuz closed and oil hit $16, China would not be the country scrambling for supply. Every barrel that reaches China through that system is a data point the ERG can point to internally. It is proof that resistance is survivable, that the faction, which says no deal on American terms is the right call, has economic evidence supporting its position. Galabaf's resignation this morning is, in a very real sense, the ERG cashing in those rungs on the confidence ladder that China built for them. And China's silence about the resignation is not indifference. It is calculated endorsement. Now let's be specific about what Galabaf's departure means for the actual deal structure, because America has been negotiating around three core demands: no nuclear enrichment, Hormuz open on terms Washington considers free navigation, and Iran's uranium stockpile physically removed from the country. At Islamabad, the diplomatic faction moved Iran 80% of the way. Galabaf and Araghchi indicated flexibility on the enrichment timeline and on where the uranium might eventually go. America proposed a 20-year pause on enrichment. Iran countered with 5 years, a 15-year gap. America said the uranium stockpile must be handed over. Iran said it will never leave the country. And then there was Hormuz. Iran insisting passage is coordinated through Iranian authorities. America insisting on free navigation that doesn't require Iranian sovereign permission. The ERG's rejection of the Qatari proposal tells you precisely what that remaining 20% gap is made of. It's not a number. It's not a formula. It's the question of whether passage through Hormuz requires Iranian permission or whether it operates under an international framework that doesn't require that permission. Galabaf was willing to explore framings that blurred that line. The ERG is not willing to blur it, and without Galabaf, whoever conducts the next round of negotiations is whoever the ERG approves, and that person will not blur the Hormuz sovereignty question. Which means the gap doesn't close. It stays the same size or it grows. There is one more dimension to this that almost no coverage is touching. Iran is now collecting tolls at Hormuz. Galabaf's own deputy confirmed this morning that Iran received its first revenue from the toll system it has imposed on ships seeking to cross the strait. Ships are paying, Iran is collecting money. This changes the ERG's incentive structure in a fundamental way. When Hormuz was leverage, the incentive was to use it to extract concessions from America to trade the threat of closure for a deal. When Hormuz becomes revenue, the incentive flips. Now the incentive is to maintain the system that generates the income. A deal that opens Hormuz under free navigation terms ends the toll revenue entirely. A deal that establishes Iranian Sovereign Coordination Authority keeps the money flowing. The ERG just demonstrated which deal it prefers by rejecting the one that moved toward the first outcome. And this morning, Trump ordered the U.S. Navy to destroy, not seize, destroy any Iranian vessel caught laying mines in Hormuz. That is an escalation in rules of engagement during a ceasefire period. The ERG's response has been silence, not a counter-threat, not a formal protest. Silence, which means either they believe they can absorb the order or they believe it changes nothing about their operational position because the mines that matter are already in the water. Either interpretation leads to the same place. The ERG is running both sides of today's news: the diplomatic displacement inside Iran and the operational silence on Trump's destroy order without a single word from the faction that supposedly led Iran's diplomacy as recently as yesterday morning. Now let's be fair, there are serious arguments on the other side, and they deserve to be taken seriously. First, Galabaf's resignation is not confirmed. The report originates from Channel 12 in Israel, which cited an unsourced television report. Israeli media has an obvious interest in portraying Iranian negotiations as collapsing. Iran's government has not confirmed the resignation. Galabaf himself has not spoken publicly until Iran officially names a replacement, or Galabaf himself addresses this. It remains an unconfirmed report. The diplomatic faction may still be functional. Second, even if the resignation is real, Araghchi remains as foreign minister. Araghchi was at Islamabad. He has been the diplomatic channel throughout this conflict. He has said at multiple points that Iran is within reach of a deal. Losing Galabaf removes one voice but does not eliminate the diplomatic infrastructure. Trump has indicated he is open to a deal quickly. The American side remains engaged even as the Iranian side reorganizes. Negotiations could resume as early as tomorrow. Third, the ERG's rejection of the Qatari proposal may actually narrow the gap rather than widen it. The Qatari arrangement was one framework among several being discussed. The ERG rejecting one specific framing doesn't foreclose other framings. A different arrangement, one that doesn't imply bilateral equivalence on Hormuz access rights, might achieve the same practical result while letting the URG claim it has maintained sovereign authority. Formulas that let both sides claim victory have produced deals before. This is how most deals at this level actually get done. These are genuine points. The unconfirmed source is a real limitation. Araghchi's presence matters, and the technical possibility of face-saving language is real. But here is what the optimistic reading cannot account for. The URG didn't just block a proposal. It removed the person who proposed it. Those are categorically different. Actions. Blocking a policy leaves the relationship intact and the negotiator in place to try again. Removing the policymaker signals that the URG doesn't trust the person making the proposals. It also signals the URG will not trust the next proposal that same person makes either. Even if Galabaf returns tomorrow, even if the resignation gets walked back entirely, the lesson has already been delivered to every Iranian diplomat watching. Make proposals the URG likes or leave. That lesson does not disappear because Galabaf's desk stays warm, and China, which has been watching Iran's internal power structure consolidate around the URG for 56 days straight, recognizes exactly what happens when military commands learn they can remove diplomats by asserting veto authority and facing no consequences for it. So watch for 3 specific things in the next 48 hours. The first is whether Iran officially confirms or denies Galabaf's resignation, not a Channel 12 report. An official Iranian government statement either confirming he has stepped back or naming who leads the next round, and pay attention to the absence of denial just as much as a confirmation, a government that wanted to counter the narrative that its chief negotiator was forced out would deny it immediately. Every hour without an official Iranian denial is an hour in which the URG's version of events goes unchallenged inside Iran's political system. Watch also whether Galabaf himself appears publicly. His personal silence is not the same as Iran's institutional silence, but it tells you whether he retains any standing to push back on what the URG did. The second thing to watch is whether any new Iranian negotiator is publicly named and what their background is. The specific name matters enormously. If the replacement comes from the civilian foreign ministry, from Araghchi's team, from the technical diplomatic staff that negotiated at Islamabad, the diplomatic faction is still present, even if under tighter URG supervision. If the replacement comes from a background with direct URG command experience, the military has not just blocked a proposal, it has installed its own representative at the table. That distinction, civilian diplomat versus URG connected figure, tells you which Iran conducts the next negotiation and whether the remaining gap narrows, holds, or grows. The third thing to watch is whether China says anything specifically about the negotiations now that the diplomatic landscape inside Iran has shifted. Wang Yi has called Araghchi 26 confirmed times during this conflict. If Wang Yi calls Araghchi today and the readout includes any language about the importance of sustained diplomatic representation, China is signaling concern about URG displacement of the civilian team. If China's next statement is a generic call for ceasefire and peaceful resolution with no reference to Galabaf's situation at all, China has decided that what the URG just did serves China's positioning better than any Chinese objection would. Also watch what happens to the toll revenue number. If Iran publicly announces cumulative toll revenue from Hormuz in the coming days, official figures, institutional language, it is not issuing a wartime bulletin. It is establishing the toll system as a permanent institutional mechanism. It is the URG saying to the world, this is how Hormuz works from now on. We manage it. We collect from it. Any deal that changes that arrangement ends a revenue stream we have already institutionalized and announced publicly. That is a very different negotiating position from the position Galabaf was trying to build. Now let's be precise about the 2 paths this moment can produce, because historically diplomatic displacement has resolved one of 2 ways, and being specific about both is more useful than vague uncertainty. The first path is that Galabaf's departure turns out to be temporary. Araghchi fills the gap. America makes a gesture, modifies blockade language, releases a detained crew member, signals flexibility on the uranium timeline, giving Iran's diplomatic factions something to point to domestically. The URG decides the gesture is sufficient to justify returning to talks without looking like it conceded the position it just asserted. Galabaf is not replaced by an URG figure. Araghchi leads the next round. The diplomatic displacement was a warning shot, not a terminal event. This path is possible. It requires America to understand that the URG's rejection was about framing, not numbers, and to construct a framework that preserves the sovereign authority claim while producing the practical outcome America needs on passage. That framework technically exists, whether American negotiators can build it without publicly conceding the sovereignty question is the operational challenge. The second path is that the URG's sidelining of Galabaf becomes permanent. The next Iranian representative at any talks is someone the URG selected rather than someone the civilian government chose. The 20% gap on Hormuz's sovereignty doesn't close. It becomes the floor of Iran's position rather than the ceiling. The URG's toll collection, its selective access list, its coordinated passage authority. All of it becomes the starting point for negotiation rather than the end state Iran is trying to reach. America's demand for free navigation becomes structurally incompatible with managed control of the strait. And a conflict with incompatible, non-negotiable positions on its central issue doesn't produce a deal. It produces an extended stalemate with periodically higher and lower violence until one side's calculation about survivability changes. Not resolution, not escalation to full war necessarily, just sustained, managed, expensive conflict, where both sides are convinced they can outlast the other because both sides have evidence supporting that belief. China is positioned for both paths. For the first path, China's facilitation role produces influence over the deal's terms. For the second path, China's dark fleet, strategic reserve, and selective access position produce commercial advantage through the extended stalemate. Either way, from China's position, the outcome is favorable. That is not an accident. That is a decade of quiet architecture delivering exactly the outcome it was designed to deliver, and China's silence about Galabaf's resignation this morning tells you China has already calculated which path it expects. Read the Times of Israel report on Galabaf's departure, specifically the detail about the Qatari proposal and the URG's grounds for rejection. Read the Euronews report on URG consolidation of power, specifically the language establishing that all critical positions must be chosen and managed directly by the Revolutionary Guards. Under wartime conditions, read the Washington Post analysis on how America's decapitation strategy removed the people who held Iran's decision-making structure together. Read the toll revenue confirmation from Galabaf's own deputy. Read what Trump posted about nobody knowing who leads Iran, and then ask the question that the press briefings are not asking today: if the man America was negotiating with just resigned because the URG blocked his proposal, and China has not said a single word about it, what exactly is China reading in that silence? What does it mean that the country with the most to gain from the outcome of these negotiations has chosen to say absolutely nothing at the exact moment the diplomatic track fractured? China already has an answer to that question. And the answer is what comes after a country loses its diplomat at the exact moment when a deal was within reach. The silence from Beijing is not confusion. It is not oversight. It is the sound of a country that built a system for precisely this contingency, watching that system perform exactly as designed, and seeing no reason to interrupt it. The question now is whether Washington is reading the same signal, because the way America responds in the next 48 hours, whether it understands what the URG's action actually means, whether it finds a framework that preserves URG authority while achieving the practical result on Hormuz, whether it recognizes that the infighting it's celebrating as Iranian weakness is actually Iranian clarity, will determine which of those two paths this conflict takes, and one of those paths has a negotiated end, the other does not.